The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint moans of fever. In a dim corner of the camp, a young Japanese nurse pressed her palm to her stomach, her body shaking from infection. Around her, other women lay on straw mats, once proud, now shadows of who they were. When footsteps approached, they braced for cruelty. Instead, an American soldier knelt and held out a small bottle of medicine. The women stared, uncertain. No words, only trembling hands exchanging something far rarer than food. Mercy. As the medicine touched her lips, tears fell quietly down her cheeks. Not from pain this time, but from the shock of kindness in a world that had forgotten what it meant. The air was thick with humidity and silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed down like a weight. A line of Japanese nurses sat shoulder to shoulder on splintered benches inside a makeshift barracks, their uniforms tattered, their faces hollow from hunger and disbelief. Beyond the bamboo walls, the jungle buzzed faintly, indifferent to the news that had just shattered their world. "Japan has surrendered," someone whispered, a trembling echo from a captured radio. No one moved. Some blinked slowly, as if their minds refused to accept the words. Others bowed their heads, lips moving soundlessly in prayer. A faint sound of weeping rippled through the room, small, restrained, like leaves rustling in still air. They had tended the wounded, buried the dead, and written letters for men who would never return home. They had believed, fiercely and blindly, that death was honor, surrender was shame. And now, in this sweltering camp surrounded by American guards, that belief was dissolving, leaving behind only fear and confusion. Private Aiko Tanaka stared at her hands. She had always been steady, even when blood slicked the floors of field hospitals. But this was something she couldn't treat or clean. Around her, the others avoided her gaze. Not from contempt, but because looking at one another meant admitting the truth. It was over. Outside, boots crunched against gravel. Foreign, confident. The Americans. Their voices carried easily, light and unbroken, a reminder of who had won. One of the younger nurses whispered, "Will they kill us?" Another shushed her quickly. The question itself felt dangerous. The barrack door creaked open, sunlight spilling across the floor. An American officer stood framed in the doorway, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. Two soldiers followed, carrying wooden crates. The women tensed, shrinking back in silence. The officer's eyes scanned the room. "You're the medics?" he asked in English. No one answered until the translator repeated the words in halting Japanese. Slowly, Aiko lifted her hand. "Hi. We are." He nodded. "You'll help distribute medicine. Your people need it." For a moment, she didn't understand. Medicine for them? The soldiers set down the crates, stepping aside. Aiko hesitated, then walked forward, her sandals whispering against the boards. She expected cruelty, maybe humiliation. Instead, she saw bottles of quinine, rolls of bandages, selves for burns. The realization came slowly, disbelieving. The enemy was helping them. Behind her, one of the women began to cry. Another covered her face. The officer turned away, pretending not to notice. Aiko pressed her hands against the crate, her pulse pounding. She didn't know whether to feel gratitude or shame. All she knew was that something inside her had cracked, not just her nation's pride, but the thin, invisible wall between captor and captive. Outside, rain began to fall softly on the tin roof. Like a benediction, the women lifted their faces toward the sound, tears blending with rainwater. Sorrow and mercy, indistinguishable. And for the first time since the war began, Aiko felt something she couldn't name. Not hope, not yet, but something close. The road stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering in the afternoon heat. The sun showed no mercy. It burned through the ragged fabric of their uniforms and pressed on their backs like punishment. A column of captured Japanese women trudged forward, their boots sinking into the dry, cracked earth. Each step raised a cloud of dust that clung to their faces, their hair, their tears. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of boots and the metallic clatter of canteens swinging from belts. Every few meters, an American guard's voice cut through the silence. Short, commanding, but not cruel. "Keep moving. Stay in line." Aiko walked near the middle, her arms bound loosely in front of her. Her head throbbed, her lips split from thirst. The sweat that had drenched her uniform that morning had already turned to a layer of grime. She tried to keep her eyes on the ground, but sometimes she couldn't help it. She looked up. Filipino villagers lined the roadside. Men stood with their arms crossed. Women clutched their children close. No one threw stones. No one shouted insults. But the silence, that silence, cut deeper than hatred. Their eyes said everything. "You are the enemy. You brought war to our home." A child, maybe 5 years old, peeked out from behind his mother's skirt. He looked at the Japanese women not with anger, but with confusion. One of the nurses saw him and smiled weakly. The mother quickly pulled the child back, turning away. The small kindness died before it could reach anyone. Behind Aiko, a nurse stumbled. Her knees buckled, her body collapsing into the dust. The line faltered. For a tense second, everyone froze, waiting for the inevitable. A shout, a rifle raised. Punishment. But the nearest guard jogged forward, knelt beside the fallen woman, and offered his canteen. The woman stared up at him, her lips trembling. She refused at first. Pride, fear, maybe both. But when he pushed it gently toward her again, she took it with shaking hands. The others watched in silence. None dared to speak, but something shifted in that moment. Confusion, disbelief. It rippled down the line like a whisper no one wanted to admit hearing. They marched on. Hours passed. The heat softened as the sun began to sink, painting the horizon with a dull, bloody orange. The air smelled of earth and smoke, of distant fires that still burned in villages broken by war. Every muscle in Aiko's body screamed, but stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant being dragged back up again. A gust of wind blew across the line, lifting the dust into their eyes. Aiko blinked against it, and for a brief second she caught sight of her own reflection in a puddle by the roadside. A face she barely recognized. Hollow eyes. Dirt streaked across her cheeks. The red cross sewn on her sleeve was torn and faded. Once, that symbol had meant she was there to heal. Now, it was just a mark of defeat. By the time they reached the POW compound, night had fallen. The guards herded them through the gate, past rows of tents and watchtowers silhouetted against the moonlight. Somewhere nearby, men were singing softly in English, a melancholy tune that drifted through the humid air. The women were told to sit. They collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to think. The guards handed out canteens and a few ration tins. One of the nurses muttered under her breath, "They feed us like strays." No one answered. Aiko tilted her head back, looking at the stars. They were the same stars that shone over Japan, yet they felt impossibly far away. Around her, the others sat in silence. Proud women reduced to prisoners, soldiers without a nation. The night insects began to hum, and the camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Somewhere in the dark, a woman began to sob. Quietly at first, then harder, her body shaking as the dam finally broke. Aiko closed her eyes and let the sound fill the emptiness inside her. The march was over, but the shame lingered, heavy, unspoken, and endless. The gates groaned open, revealing rows of barbed wire glinting beneath the afternoon sun like cruel strands of silver. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint metallic scent of rust. The women shuffled forward, shadows stretching long across the packed earth. Guards shouted orders in English. Fast, sharp, unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakable. Command, control, victory. The Americans stood tall, their khaki uniforms crisp, their boots polished. They laughed among themselves as they directed the new arrivals, their laughter slicing through the silence like a blade. To the weary Japanese nurses, it sounded cruel, even if it wasn't meant to be. Every chuckle echoed the same word: defeat. Private Miller leaned against a wooden post, cigarette hanging from his lips. He'd seen prisoners before, hollow-eyed men broken by war. But this was different. These were women, nurses. Some were barely older than his sister back home in Kansas. Their faces were streaked with dirt, yet behind it, he saw traces of dignity refusing to die. One woman caught his eye. She moved stiffly, chin lifted, her bound hands trembling. When a guard barked an order, she flinched but didn't lower her gaze. Miller muttered, "Tough one, huh?" Inside the barracks, the air was thick with mildew and despair. Wooden bunks lined the walls, some broken, others covered in ragged blankets. The women whispered prayers, voices trembling, a soft chorus of Japanese rising through the stale air. Aiko sat on the edge of her bunk, tracing the splintered wood. She thought of the hospital she once served, the scent of the sea, the laughter of patients who believed they'd live. That world was gone. Around her, the others straightened their uniforms, retied their hair, small rituals of pride in a place built to strip them of it. Outside, Miller unloaded supplies. "Don't know why we're wasting rations on them," a corporal grumbled. Miller glanced at the women. "Because they're human," he said quietly. As dusk fell, the women were given thin soup and bread. Aiko raised the bowl to her lips and froze. A faint taste of chicken. Her eyes watered. She didn't know if it was from gratitude or humiliation. Miller saw her wrist swollen and bruised. He hesitated, then crouched near the fence. "You hurt?" he asked gently. They stared, unsure. He mimed the pain, then slid a small white tin through the wire. Bandages, antiseptic, tablets. The woman's fingers brushed his as she whispered, "Arigato." Miller turned away, pretending not to hear. Behind him, the women huddled around the tin like it was something holy. Proof that even in war, kindness could survive. The rain came just before nightfall, a hesitant drizzle that turned the camp's dust into thin layers of mud. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down like a weight. Inside the barracks, the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, sweat, and quiet despair. Dinner had been hours ago, if it could be called dinner at all. 1 tin of rice, meant for 10, had been divided among 20 women. Each scoop was barely a spoonful. They sat in a circle, eating in near darkness, passing the bowl like a sacred ritual. The faint sound of chewing filled the room, respectful, restrained. Hunger had stripped them of the energy to complain. Aiko watched the youngest nurse, Hana, hesitate with her share. She looked at the older woman beside her, trembling from fever, and split her meager portion in half. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but Aiko saw it. Her throat tightened. When the rain began to fall harder, the women carried their empty tins outside, setting them beneath the eaves to catch water. A few shallow puddles formed, enough for each to cup her hands and drink greedily. Some tilted their faces upward, letting the rain wash over cracked lips. Inside, a deep, rasping cough broke the quiet. Sato, once the strongest among them, now lay pale and burning with fever. Aiko pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering, "Rest. The fever will break." But she didn't believe her own words. Keiko knelt beside her. "We need medicine," she said softly, glancing toward the guards' quarters. "The Americans gave us some before. Maybe—" Aiko shook her head. "Not tonight." Outside, Thunder rolled in the distance like artillery echoing from a war that refused to end. The barracks darkened, water dripping through the roof onto the sleeping women. One by one they lay close together for warmth, fragile, desperate, bound by the will to survive. Aiko stayed awake, her stomach aching with hunger. She thought of Japan, the rising sun, her mother's cooking, the scent of rice. The memory felt cruel now. Beside her, Sato whispered, "Aiko, will they let us go?" Aiko hesitated. "Yes," she lied gently. "When peace is certain." Outside, Private Miller stood by the fence, rain soaking through his coat. He heard their coughing and clenched his fists. He had medicine, just enough to save one or two. His fingers touched the small tin in his pocket. He froze, then turned away, the storm swallowing his hesitation. Inside, Aiko whispered, "We'll survive tonight. Tomorrow we'll find strength again." And as the rain poured harder, her promise lingered in the darkness. Fragile, but enough to keep hope alive. The camp was quieter than usual that night. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made every sound feel louder than it should be. The rain had stopped, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the faint glow of lanterns hanging from the guard posts. Private Miller sat on his bunk, staring at the tin cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. The women behind the wire, pale and hollow-eyed, clinging to one another like driftwood in a storm. He could still hear the coughing, faint but constant, even from his quarters. The sound carried through the damp air, seeping into his thoughts until it became unbearable. He rubbed his temple, muttering under his breath, "They're not my problem. They're not my people." But the words tasted wrong. Across the room, Corporal Jenkins was snoring softly, his boots still on, one arm draped over his rifle. Miller glanced at him, then toward the window where the barbed wire glistened in the moonlight. Beyond it, the women's barracks. He took a slow breath and stood. In the dim light of the medic's tent, the smell of iodine and wet canvas hung heavy. The camp medic, Sergeant Rowe, was hunched over a wooden table cleaning instruments. His sleeves were rolled up, cigarette balanced on his lip. He didn't look up when Miller entered. "You're off duty, soldier. What do you need?" Miller hesitated. "Antibiotics. Just a few." Rowe finally looked at him, a long, assessing stare. "For who?" Miller didn't answer. Rowe set down the scalpel and leaned back in his chair. "Don't tell me it's for them." Miller's silence said everything. "Jesus Christ, Miller," Rowe muttered, dragging a hand over his face. "You know the orders. We don't waste supplies on enemy POWs. They've got rations, water, shelter. That's it. They're lucky to have that much." "They're dying," Miller said quietly. "Fever. Infection. I've seen it." Rowe exhaled a long stream of smoke. "And I've seen what happens when a man forgets who the enemy is." Miller's jaw tightened. "They're not soldiers anymore. They're just—" He stopped himself. The right word didn't exist. Not victims, not enemies, just people. Rowe stood and walked to the medicine chest. "You're risking a court-martial for a bunch of nurses who'd have patched up their own men so they could kill ours." Miller didn't look away. "Maybe, but right now, they're not doing any of that. They're sick, and I can do something about it." The older man sighed, shaking his head. "You're a damn fool." He opened a drawer, pulled out a small brown bottle, and shoved it toward him. 2 doses. "That's all I can spare. If you get caught, I will never see you." Miller nodded. "Thank you." Rowe's voice stopped him at the door. "You think this makes you noble, son? It doesn't. It just makes the war harder to understand." Outside, the moon slipped behind a cloud. The camp was a shadowy maze of fences and puddles, every sound amplified by tension. Miller moved quickly, hugging the edge of the fence line. His boots splashed softly in the mud. He kept low, counting steps, every heartbeat matching the rhythm of his breath. At the far end of the enclosure, a guard leaned against a post, humming a low tune. Miller waited until the man turned to light his cigarette, then slipped behind a stack of supply crates. The women's barracks were just ahead, a silhouette of worn wood and rusted tin. Through the cracks in the boards, he saw them, sleeping shapes huddled close together. Aiko was awake, sitting near the door, her eyes wide in the dark. When she saw the figure outside, she stiffened. Miller raised a finger to his lips and crouched low. He pulled the medicine from his pocket and slid it through a gap in the wall. "For the sick one," he whispered, "twice a day." Aiko didn't move at first. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bottle. Their fingers brushed again, that same brief, electric moment of shared humanity. She mouthed a single word. "Why?" Miller hesitated, his throat tightening. "Because someone should." Then he was gone, melting back into the night before the next guard's footsteps reached the corner. Inside, Aiko clutched the bottle to her chest, as though it were made of gold. Around her, the women stirred, whispering softly, the word medicine passing between them like a fragile spark. Outside the wire, Miller stopped near the fence and looked up at the stars. The same stars shining over Kansas, over Japan, over graves that stretched across continents. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel right. Just human. And in war, that was the most dangerous feeling of all. The moon hung low and silver, spilling cold light over the camp. Barbed wire shimmered like frost, the ground slick with rain. Private Miller moved through the shadows, a small brown bottle clutched in his hand. So light, yet it felt heavier than his rifle. Each step sank into mud and guilt. The women's barracks loomed ahead, silent except for faint coughing. The air smelled of damp wood, rust, and sickness. He hesitated at the fence, heart pounding as a spotlight swept across the yard. When it passed, he crept to the cracked door and tapped lightly. Silence. Then it opened just enough for a pair of frightened eyes. Aiko's. She gasped at the sight of his uniform, stepping back as the others huddled in the shadows. Miller lifted his empty hand. "It's all right," he whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you." He crouched, holding out the bottle. Medicine. For the sick one. The moonlight glinted off the glass. Aiko hesitated, then reached out with trembling fingers as though afraid it might disappear. "Take it," he said quietly. "Small doses. Twice a day." Her voice came out thin, uncertain. "Why? You help." He swallowed. "Because you remind me of someone." Aiko clutched the bottle to her chest. Behind her, one woman began to pray softly, a trembling melody of gratitude and fear. Miller felt something twist inside him, a warmth that didn't belong in war. Then, "Boots." A guard's voice shouted in the distance. Miller stiffened, stepping back. "Hide it," he whispered urgently. "Don't let them see." Aiko nodded, slipping the bottle beneath her blanket, her eyes locked on his. For a moment, they weren't enemies, just two people trying to hold on to their humanity. Miller vanished into the darkness as the guard's flashlight swept past. Hidden behind crates, he watched the light fade before breathing again. Through a crack in the wall, he saw Aiko kneel beside a frail woman, pouring a few drops of medicine into a tin cup. The woman's lips moved. A quiet, "Thank you." Miller felt something unexplainable stir in his chest. The war wasn't over. The fences still stood. But under that cold, watching moon, compassion had crossed the wire. Morning came slow and heavy, the kind of morning that carried no bird song, only the metallic hum of the camp and the distant groan of the jungle waking up. Inside the women's barracks, the air was thick with the smell of sickness and damp earth. Aiko sat against the wall, the small brown bottle clutched to her chest like a relic. The woman who'd been fevered through the night, Yumi, now breathed softly, her skin no longer burning like fire. No one spoke for a long time. They just listened to her breathing, the rhythm fragile but steady, like the sound of hope returning. Aiko looked around the dim room, her eyes meeting the other women. They didn't smile. Not yet. But their silence had changed. It wasn't despair anymore. It was disbelief. When the door creaked open and sunlight spilled across the dirt floor, the women blinked, shielding their eyes. An American guard passed by outside, his boots thudding on the ground. Aiko tensed, instinctively hiding the medicine beneath a torn blanket. But the guard didn't look in. He just kept walking. By midday, the fever had broken. Aiko used a scrap of cloth to wipe Yumi's face, whispering soft words in Japanese that none of the guards would understand. Another woman, Hana, approached quietly with a small cup of water. "She'll live," Hana said, her voice trembling. "Because of that man." The others nodded. They didn't know his name, only his face, shadowed by moonlight. To them, he wasn't an American soldier anymore. He was something else, something far rarer in war, a reminder that mercy still existed. But whispers have wings in a camp like that. By afternoon, word had already begun to move. It started among the prisoners, the story of the soldier who gave medicine to the enemy. Then it reached the guards, passed like smoke between cigarettes and muttered in disbelief over ration tins. "Private Miller," one said, half smirking. "You're telling me he's playing nurse to the Japs now?" Another shrugged. "They're half dead already. Maybe he just didn't want to watch 'em rot." The talk reached the camp kitchen before nightfall. One of the cooks, a broad man with hands always red from heat, stood staring at a half loaf of bread. He'd heard the story twice now, each time with a little less mockery. That evening, as he walked to the refuse pile, he dropped the bread near the barracks wall, pretending it was by accident. Aiko found it an hour later. She stared at the soft loaf in disbelief, her breath catching. Bread. Real bread, not rice husks or scraps. The women divided it into thin, trembling portions, careful to make sure each one had a piece. When the first bite touched her tongue, Hana cried. She tried to hide it, but Aiko saw, and the sight made her chest ache. That night, the guards on patrol lingered longer near the women's section. One slipped an old blanket through the wire, muttering, "Don't say nothing." His voice was rough, ashamed almost, but the act spoke louder than anything he could have said. By the end of the week, something unspoken had taken root in the camp, fragile, invisible, but growing. The women still bowed their heads when a guard passed, still living beneath the threat of punishment and hunger. Yet between them and a few quiet soldiers, a current of compassion began to flow beneath the surface. Private Miller watched from a distance, careful not to be seen. He saw one of the women, the tall one with the narrow eyes, maybe Aiko, wrap a younger girl in a new blanket, her hands gentle. He noticed the way the guards had stopped sneering, how their jokes had softened, their eyes darting away in guilt when they saw the women's hollow faces. The war hadn't ended. The world was still bleeding, but here, in this forgotten patch of jungle and wire, something was shifting, something the bullets couldn't touch. That night, Miller sat outside the barracks fence, lighting a cigarette he didn't intend to smoke. He watched the smoke twist upward and vanish into the humid air. The same moon that had watched his act of defiance now glowed above the camp like a silent witness. Inside, Aiko sat awake, the medicine bottle empty but clean. She turned it over in her hands, then whispered a quiet prayer, not for Japan, not for victory, but for the man who had remembered they were human. In the days that followed, the guards pretended not to notice when an extra ration went missing, or when a blanket turned up in the wrong barracks. They'd glance away, mutter something about inventory errors, and keep walking. The fences still stood, the guns still hung heavy on every shoulder. But somehow the war felt a little less cold. It was dangerous, what was happening, this quiet rebellion of kindness. Yet no one tried to stop it. Maybe they all understood in their own silent way that compassion, once awakened, could spread like fire, even in the darkest of prisons. They wrote. The camp was quiet that evening. Too quiet. The kind of silence that made the jungle hum louder, as if the earth itself had decided to whisper. Smoke from the guard post drifted low, carrying the bitter scent of burnt coffee and damp wood. Inside the women's barracks, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the warmth of too many bodies and the unspoken thoughts of women who had been soldiers, healers, and now ghosts of what they once were. Aiko sat cross-legged near the wall, a sliver of candlelight flickering beside her. In her lap lay a scrap of paper, torn from a medical logbook the Americans had thrown away. The paper was creased and smudged, but to her it was sacred. She dipped the tip of a makeshift pen, a thin twig sharpened and burned black at the end, into a small puddle of ink she'd traded from a guard for sewing his torn sleeve. Her hand trembled as she began to write. Mother, I'm alive. She stopped, the words blurring before her eyes. The candle flame wavered, as if reacting to the weight of her thoughts. She hadn't written her mother's name since before the surrender. To write it now felt like summoning a ghost from across an ocean that no longer knew her. Around her, the other women were doing the same. Each clutched a piece of paper or fabric, anything that could hold ink. The air was filled with soft scratching sounds, broken only by the distant thud of boots outside the wire. Yumi, the one who had nearly died of fever, whispered under her breath as she wrote. To my brother, I'm sorry for the shame I brought. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. Hana was weeping quietly, her tears falling onto the paper, smearing her words until they looked like rain on glass. Aiko kept writing. She told her mother about the camp, about the hunger, the heat, and the faces of the women who still found ways to smile even when they had no reason to. But most of all, she wrote about him, the American soldier with tired eyes who had given her the bottle of medicine. She didn't know his name, she didn't know why he'd risked himself for them, but she wrote that, for one night, the war had felt far away, as if someone had opened a door and let light into the dark. The words came faster now, as though her heart had waited too long to speak. She wrote about the bread that appeared at the wall, the blanket that came in the night, the way the guards had started looking at them differently. She wrote about compassion, how it had arrived quietly, without fanfare, like a breeze that no one expected but everyone needed. When she finished, she folded the paper with trembling hands. For a moment, she just held it to her chest, as if warmth could travel across time and ocean to reach home. Then she leaned forward and slipped it beneath a loose plank in the floor. One by one, the other women followed. Letters written to fathers, husbands, children, confessions of guilt, fragments of hope, and prayers for forgiveness. Some wrote apologies to the dead. Others wrote to themselves, to the versions of who they were before the war stripped everything away. As the last letter disappeared under the boards, Aiko felt a strange calm settle over the room. No one spoke. They just sat there, listening to the jungle breathing outside, the chirp of crickets, the low rumble of thunder far off in the mountains. Outside, the guards made their rounds. Private Miller passed by, his rifle slung low. Through the gap in the wooden wall, Aiko caught a glimpse of him. He paused, glancing toward the barracks as if sensing something, but didn't enter. Their eyes didn't meet, yet she felt an understanding pass between them, a quiet thread of shared exhaustion and unspoken gratitude. When he walked away, Aiko whispered a single line in Japanese, "Arigato, thank you." The candle flickered lower, the wax dripping slowly onto the dirt. The letters beneath the floor were silent now, hidden but alive. They were not meant to be sent. They were meant to be remembered. As rain began to fall outside, light drops tapping the tin roof, Aiko lay back on the hard floor. She closed her eyes and imagined the letters surviving long after they were gone, after the fences rusted, after the guards went home, after the war was forgotten. Each letter was a heartbeat trapped in paper. Each word is a piece of a soul refusing to disappear, and somewhere in the dark, beneath the hum of the rain, the women of the camp slept. Not peacefully, but with something close to it. For the first time in months, they had spoken their truth into the world, even if no one would ever read it. It was enough. The morning of their release began not with cheers, but with disbelief. The women awoke to the metallic clang of the camp gates opening, a sound that once filled them with dread. This time, it carried something strange and unfamiliar. Silence from the guards. No barked orders, no shouted commands, just the wind brushing through the palms, stirring up the dust that had settled on everything, even hope. Aiko sat up slowly, her body thin, her bones sharp beneath the worn fabric of her uniform. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The women around her did too. They exchanged cautious glances, waiting for the routine to begin. Roll call, rations, work. But none came. Instead, an officer stood by the gate, holding a list. His voice, when it came, was softer than any of them had ever heard inside those walls. "You're going home." The words fell heavy, almost unbelievable. Home. The word had become foreign, a place that existed only in memory. The women didn't cheer. They didn't even move at first. They just stared at one another, half afraid the sound was a cruel joke. Then, slowly, Yumi began to cry, a small, stifled sob that spread like a spark. One by one, they wept quietly, as if afraid to draw attention to their own joy. The Americans began organizing them, handing out papers, small bundles of food and pieces of clothing from the supply tent. It wasn't much, but after months of deprivation, it felt like abundance. One guard tried to smile as he handed Aiko a canteen. She nodded faintly, unable to form the words. Her throat ached from disuse. It felt strange to even imagine saying, "Thank you." At the far end of the yard, Private Miller stood apart from the others, leaning against the fence. His helmet hung loosely in his hand. He looked older now, wearier, as though each day in the camp had carved a line into his face, but his eyes softened as he watched the women gathering their things, helping one another to their feet. He had wondered, more than once, if he'd ever see this day, if any of them would. The bottle of medicine, the stolen bread, the quiet defiance that had kept him human. All of it seemed like another lifetime. Yet now, as the gates opened, he felt something ache deep in his chest. He didn't know what to call it. Relief, maybe, or guilt. Perhaps both. The women lined up, their steps unsteady but determined. Aiko stood at the front, her posture still carrying the dignity of a nurse, even if her uniform hung loosely on her frail body. When she reached the threshold of the gate, the line between captivity and whatever waited beyond, she paused. Miller was watching her. She felt it before she saw him. Their eyes met through the thin mesh of barbed wire. For a heartbeat, the noise of the camp disappeared. No shuffling feet, no murmurs, no wind. Just the two of them suspended in the weight of everything unspoken. She bowed deeply, her head low, her hands trembling at her sides. It was not the bow of subservience, but of reverence, the only language left between them. Miller swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice wouldn't come. Words felt too small, too fragile for what this moment carried. So he lifted a hand, just slightly. A gesture of respect, almost like a salute, but softer. Aiko straightened, her eyes glassy with tears she refused to let fall. Then she turned, joining the others as they began the slow walk beyond the fence. The road stretched before them, wide and endless, lined with palm trees that swayed gently in the warm Philippine air. Each step was an echo of survival. The sound of sandals against dirt, the faint rustle of fabric, the rhythm of hearts relearning freedom. Behind them, the camp loomed like a shadow, a place that had stolen so much and yet left behind something impossible to destroy. Miller watched until they disappeared beyond the curve of the road. Only then did he realize he'd been gripping the fence so tightly that his palms were bleeding. He let go, wiping his hands against his uniform. The barbs had drawn blood, but he didn't care. He looked down at the ground near the gate and noticed something half buried in the dirt. A piece of paper, folded and damp from last night's rain. He bent down and picked it up carefully. It was written in Japanese. The ink faded, the handwriting delicate and slanted. He couldn't read the words, but he didn't need to. He folded it again, tucking it into his pocket. As the sun climbed higher, the camp grew quieter. The war was ending, but its ghosts would remain. In the letters, in the faces, in the quiet acts of mercy that no one would ever record. Miller stood alone by the fence for a long time, the wind tugging at his sleeves, the smell of rain still lingering in the air. Somewhere out there, Aiko was walking toward a home that might not exist anymore. But she was walking. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe that was enough. The rain was falling softly against the paper walls of the house, a gentle, rhythmic sound that seemed to carry both the weight of time and the mercy of it. The air smelled faintly of green tea and cedar wood, the kind of scent that lingers in old homes long after memory begins to fade. Aiko sat near the window, her frail hands wrapped around a porcelain cup that had long gone cold. Her granddaughter knelt nearby, notebook in hand, eyes wide with the curiosity only youth could hold. The girl had asked the question quietly, almost shyly. "Grandmother, what was it like, the war?" Aiko didn't answer at first. She stared out the window, where the rain fell in thin silver lines, blurring the garden beyond. Her reflection in the glass was pale and soft, a ghost of the young woman she once was, hidden beneath the folds of years and silence. She had not spoken of that time for decades. Some stories she had learned were easier to bury than to relive, but tonight felt different. The air had a stillness that felt like permission. Her lips parted and her voice came out slow, fragile. "It was very quiet at the end," she began. "After so much noise, the bombs, the cries, the orders, there was only silence. A silence so deep it hurts to breathe." The girl leaned closer, her pen hovering above the paper. Aiko smiled faintly, noticing the eagerness in her eyes. She had been like that once, young, curious, unbroken by what the world could do. "There was a man," Aiko continued, her voice trembling just slightly. "An American soldier. I never knew his name." She set the teacup down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "He came one night with medicine. I thought it was a trick at first. Many of us did. But he didn't speak. He only held it out, and when I took it, he nodded, as if that was enough." The rain deepened, tapping gently on the roof like quiet applause. "I remember how his hands shook," she said softly. "He was scared too, though he was supposed to be the strong one. His eyes, they weren't like the others. Not cruel, just tired. So very tired." Her granddaughter frowned slightly, as though trying to understand how an enemy could be anything but monstrous. "Did you hate him?" she asked carefully. Aiko looked up, her expression unreadable. "At first, yes, I had to. It was how we survived, by hating those who hurt us. But when he brought that medicine, something changed. It wasn't just pain it healed. It was something here." She touched her chest lightly. He gave me back something I didn't realize I'd lost. The belief that kindness could still exist even after all the ugliness. The room went quiet again except for the steady rain. The girl looked down at her notebook, unsure what to write next. Aiko gazed at her for a long moment, her eyes filled with the weight of decades and the gentleness that comes after understanding. "You know," she whispered, "I used to think survival meant staying alive. But now I think it means remembering. Remembering the small mercies, not just the pain." She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. He was the enemy, yes. But at that moment, he was also human, and so was I. The candle beside them flickered, casting a soft glow over her lined face. The girl set down her pen, overcome by the quiet reverence in her grandmother's words. Aiko reached for her granddaughter's hand, her skin paper-thin and cool. "When people talk about war," she said, "they always speak of victory and loss. But what I remember most is the silence, the moments between fear and mercy. That's where the truth lives." Outside, the storm began to fade, the rain easing into a mist that hung low over the garden. Aiko leaned back, her eyes distant but peaceful. "He gave me medicine," she murmured, almost to herself now. "But what healed me was his kindness." Her granddaughter squeezed her hand gently, the candle's light catching the tears that shimmered in Aiko's eyes. And as the old woman smiled, fragile, timeless, and human, the room seemed to grow lighter, as though the ghosts of that long-ago war had finally found rest in the telling of the story. Beyond the window, the last drops of rain clung to the leaves before falling, vanishing into the soil. The war was long over, but its quiet echoes of pain, compassion, and forgiveness lived on in her voice, soft as the rain itself.